Mr. Jewett.
And I'm Mr. Decker. I'm going to turn Mr. Jewett's volume up a little bit. There we go. So, anyway, we're back. Yeah, very funny. Great job. So,
Thanks.
we're back and kind of getting close to the end of the war here in Europe.
Yeah, we're gonna focus now on the year of 1945, and if we're talking about the war in Europe in 1945, it's pretty obvious at this point that the Allies are gonna win. Germany, Italy's pretty much done. A lot of their supply lines are cut off from the Middle East. And then you have pressure from the Soviets from the east, the United States and British, Canadian forces as well from the west, and then the United States and other allies are pushing in from the south through Italy. So at this point, it's just kind of a race to see who can get to Germany first.
Yep. The writing was on the wall for Germany when it could only get France out of the war early by unsuccessfully trying to defeat the Soviets and knock out the British. The German ability to win the war was pretty much gone. So by the time we reach 1945, everyone kind of knows what's up. So rather than waiting for the war to be over to talk about the end of the war, the leaders of the big three countries, which were the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, have a conference in Yalta, which is in Crimea, which is in Ukraine, to talk about what the end of the war is going to look like.
Yeah, and you mentioned these three leaders. You have one of, if not the most famous photograph of World War II taken of these three leaders sitting there, and that's Winston Churchill of Britain, FDR from the United States, and Stalin from the Soviets.
Yep, and this is one of those cases where even though we're fighting on the same side, we're not necessarily very good friends. So they all felt like it was important to have this conference to kind of establish this definition of peace moving forward because the Soviets kind of wanted one thing, which was, um, you know, communism and all the territory that it had claimed against Germany to stay communist or at least be Soviet and under their influence, whereas the US and the UK kind of wanted to limit Soviet power and protect democracy and capitalism throughout the world. So there's already this sort of clashing belief system going on between the Soviets and the rest of the democratic world.
Yeah, and this problem persists well into the 50s and 60s as well. Um, but yeah, let's talk about the Alta and not get too carried away with problems down the road.
Yeah. So just real quick, major bullet points. Everybody agreed that Germany had to surrender unconditionally, which meant like Germany gets nothing and just has to give up. Like the war is over and you get nothing. And they also agreed that they were going to divide Germany into four occupation zones, which would be controlled by the U.S., the U.K., France, and the Soviets. Poland is allowed to exist again, and Stalin promises free elections in Poland. The United Nations, which you'll learn about in eighth grade, but the United Nations gets formed, and the Soviets promised to enter the war against Japan 3 months after the end of the war in Europe.
Yeah, very few of those things happen, but in the meantime, shortly after this conference, after this meeting, just a handful of months afterwards, Germany's out of the war. You have pretty much a foot race between the Soviets and the British slash United States soldiers to see who can get to Berlin first. And actually, the Soviets get there first, and instead of surrendering, Adolf Hitler famously commits suicide in a bunker.
Yep. So with that, the war is over. However, it
Well,
seems
the European theater is over.
right.
World
Yeah.
War II is still not over.
May 8th is called VE Day, which means Victory in Europe Day. Um, but after a couple months, it seems pretty clear that Stalin's not holding up his end of the deal. He wipes out all the democracy protesters in Poland, which means Poland goes communist, obviously. And he does similar things in all the other countries in Eastern and Central Europe, so now the Soviet Union is much larger. So they hold another conference in Potsdam, which is in Germany. And at this point, FDR is dead, so Truman goes, and a new leader of the UK goes because Winston Churchill's government is defeated. There's an entire aside here where Winston Churchill had been arguing for declaring war on the Soviet Union, and the people of Britain were like, no. So, new leaders, except for Stalin. Stalin never goes away. And they meet again in Germany.
Yeah, and they focus a little bit on prosecuting the Nazi criminals, war criminals. We're going to focus a little bit more on that next week. I think that's going to be Wednesday's lesson of things that Nazi leaders would have done to deserve being called war criminals. But a big part of that Potsdam conference is figuring out what to do with them.
Yep. They also finalized the occupation zones for Germany. All the land, like any previous countries, are given the same borders, which means, like, for example, in Belarus still exists, but it's just now the Soviet Socialist Republic of Belarus. Or the areas of France get returned to France. Belgium gets returned to Belgium. That sort of thing.
Right. Pretty much if you're west of Germany, you get to be your country that you were before the war. But if you're east of Germany, you are pretty much in control by the Soviets.
Yeah. So it's pretty clear that there are two superpowers in the world now. It's the United States and it's the Soviet Union. They then sent a message to Japan, including the leader Chiang Kai-shek from China, and they said surrender or face prompt and utter destruction, because Truman is at this point hinting that the U.S. has a new toy, as you might call it, that is a little bit dangerous and could cause overwhelming destruction to any target it's used upon.
I don't know if I'd call it a toy.
Well, I feel like that's not a good term, but it's kind of when you build enough of them to wipe out all life on planet Earth 100,000 times. Well,
Yeah, solid point. But yeah, we're talking about the atomic bombs, Manhattan Project. We'll get to that next week, though.
yep. So that is basically the end of the war. Just quickly mention again, Germany is divided into 4 zones. Eventually, the 3 zones controlled by the US, the UK, and France combine to create what's called West Germany, whereas the Soviet side is just called East Germany.
Yep, and that is a problem in and of itself, and that rears its ugly head in about 40 years after.
Yeah. So, anyway, that's pretty much it for the end of the war in Europe. Germany is officially lost. Hitler is dead, and we have broken the German Empire and divided up all of its land.
Yep, and now we need to turn focus on to finishing off Japan and the Pacific Theater, and then kind of figuring out the aftermath that was the Germans killing millions of people.
Right. So, with that, I'm Mr. Decker,
And I'm Mr. Jewett.
and we will see you next week.